Our next speaker is Chris Lennon from Media Answers.
All right, so we've been talking a lot about moving things to the cloud, and at least to me that implies microservices. And so when we talk about microservices in our business, it begs the question, like all the kids in the back seat of the car, are we there yet? Do we actually have a solution in place for this? You might be asking the same question after a long day of sessions here. Are we there yet? You almost are there. This is the second to the last session. So just to wake everybody up and entertain you to begin this, we'll go, hello.
Are we there yet?
No.
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 Are we there yet?
You little.
I think we're there.
So I don't know if that really answered the question, but maybe over the next few slides we will. So, why care about this? As we move to cloud deployments and microservice architectures, I think it makes the whole topic of interoperability far more important among systems that you're dealing with. And we'll get into why that is in a little bit here. What I end up running into with a lot of the cloud migration projects I'm involved with my team is that there are always things kind of lurking in the cloud that you don't really expect, and issues that get in the way that you might make some assumptions that things are just going to work together nicely, and they don't necessarily. The best analogy I can come up with is it gets a little bit like herding cats, where you are dealing with so many different services from so many different vendors. You can't just assume that it's all going to kind of plug together and play nicely. More often than not, it ends up more like this picture. So, a few quotes here that I think kind of set the stage for I think where we are with microservices in media. And I think this is a great one. This is the CEO of IHG saying, it's no longer the big beating the small, but the fast beating the slow. And of course, how are you doing that? You're doing that with microservices to a large degree. And I think there's a big disconnect in my experience between the promise of the wonderful panacea that microservices offers versus the reality of what's really out there. So I think there's two different perspectives you can look at this from. From media organizations, they're looking for solutions out there that are cloud native. Get your buzzword bingo cards out, plug and play. They work together nicely, and they work across platforms because you don't always have a single cloud platform that you're running these things on. So that's kind of what organizations are looking for here. On the other hand, I think vendors are looking for something a little bit different. They like the idea of discoverability, being able to have new customers discover their services and buy them, use them. They're interested in finding new markets through using microservices. And then that doesn't even mention all the internal reasons that vendors love microservices for their efficiency for rolling out new features and doing so with minimal resources. So, in terms of the reality versus what the real promise is, there really is no silver bullet here. What we often end up with is when people say, "Hey, the kind of solution I'm promising you here," it kind of ends up like this. You got the wonderful ad for the food, and then when you actually get the food in front of you, it doesn't quite reflect what the ad has in it. And I think that's a reflection of kind of what we're seeing in the area of microservice-based architectures and cloud deployments. So, again, it's good to talk about what are we really even talking about here. Maybe I should have made this the first slide is, what is a microservice? There's as many definitions of that as there are people in this room at least. But I thought this one's not a bad one. It doesn't really talk about how granular it is, but loosely coupled service-oriented architecture with bounded contexts. And I think I'd add to that down on a fairly fine granular level. And a good example of that, and here's an example of an aircraft being built. Where maybe in the old monolithic days, you might have one big factory that builds all of this. They fabricate everything. It all comes together. That's really not the case anymore when you're talking about commercial airliners from Airbus and Boeing. There are factories across several different regions, several different countries. They're each building their own little bit of it, and somehow it all comes together in the end, and you've got an aircraft that hopefully flies. And that's really kind of the idea behind microservices, is that you can have all these little bits that are made by disparate contributors. They all come together, and in the end, you've got something that serves an overall need. And I think this is something that's kind of important to remember. A microservice is small, and so it's necessarily simple. However, when you talk about a microservice architecture, it's going to be complex. And the reason for that is you've boiled down the simplicity to each service, and then you end up with a ton of different services that are talking together and a lot of different APIs and that sort of thing. So you end up with an overall architecture that's not so simple, where you thought, hey, going to microservices is going to simplify everything. Well, it does on a service-by-service level, but really not in an overall architecture view. I think another good guideline is, and people say, what should I move to a microservice-based architecture? And I think a good guideline is that you shouldn't just move things to a microservice-based architecture just for the sake of doing it. You should do it if you've got something that's just become too complex to manage under a monolithic type of architecture that you've got now. So if it's just too complex, if it's buckling under its own weight, then maybe going to a microservice-based architecture makes sense. But otherwise, just moving things to this for the sake of being current and attractive is not really a good reason to do it. So, there are a lot of things that I think that contribute to the challenges that we have today in interoperability amongst microservice-based systems. And there are a lot of things that people like to assume that are just not true. The network's reliable. We don't have any latency. Bandwidth's not an issue, it's infinite. We have security, not always true. The topology, it's set, it's never gonna change. There's only one administrator I need to worry about, and if he's got everything he needs, it's all gonna work. Transport cost is zero. That's a big gotcha that people run into. And the network is homogeneous. That's not always true. So there's a lot of assumptions here that I think people get trapped into making and saying, oh, well, these are all givens, and so this is all just gonna work together just fine. These are not givens. That's just another kind of a caution. Bring up a couple of tweets that I think were kind of interesting. This was a neat one that says, if one service dies and your whole system breaks, you don't have a service-oriented architecture. You have a monolith whose brain has been chopped up and stuck in jars. I think that's kind of a cool one. On the tweeting topic, we've also got this one. I love this one. Replaced our monolith with microservices, so every outage could be like a murder mystery. I take it by the laughter in here, we can all relate to this. It's the whole theory of breaking things up into little bits is really terrific until you have problems and you don't have one thing to point at anymore. So thought that was pretty good. And part of the reason for that is, what we're kind of all used to from the good old monolithic days is something like this, where you actually had a layer with APIs that are sitting between the apps and the service mesh, and you got this, these nice, maybe kind of large, maybe kind of complex APIs, but they're kind of isolated in their own area, and your interoperability, where you have issues, you can kind of point at one little area. You want to guess where this moves when you go to microservice-based architecture? It all moves down here. So you've got many different APIs, many different levels of interoperability. And so, it goes back to that whole murder mystery thing. It becomes very difficult to pinpoint where the issues are. And interoperability is no longer a given, whereas in the old setup, well, let's go back one. In the old setup, it was pretty easy to point where your problems are when you ran into issues. When you're down at this kind of level, it becomes a little more challenging. So I'm not trying to be doom and gloom here, but that's just kind of the reality of where we are. So interoperability, major challenge because of that, where you're moving from a monolithic app with maybe a single API that might have been pretty complex, but at least it was a single API. With microservices, you've got many points of potential integration and again, points of potential failure. So how do we address this? What we did is, having looked at this over the last couple of years and talking to a lot of different vendors, everybody seemed to agree that, yes, we have a problem here, and we need to facilitate this interoperability a little bit better. We need to get together as an industry, both as all the media organizations who are out there and the vendors who service this industry, to get together and try to overcome some of the obstacles that are put in place by microservices, and so that we can all realize the real promise of microservices, which I think we all agree that this is the way to go, but there are some challenges there. So the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers got involved in this about a year ago, and took a look at what problems are there that really can be solved here, and started some work through 2018 on doing some basic terms and definitions. I think that's an important place to start. Even just agreeing on what do we mean by microservices, that's not a given. So, we needed to kind of go through that of what do we mean by all these different terms? Let's make sure we're all on the same page. In the area of architectural requirements, looking at things like what level of granularity are we getting down to in terms of decomposition down into microservices, some topics like authentication, security, infrastructures, discovery, which came up again and again as an important thing from the vendor perspective, managing resources, managing versioning, managing errors and exceptions. So these were kind of identified as big, high-level architectural things that we needed to get some kind of agreement on if we were going to overcome some of the interoperability issues amongst systems. But what was just as important as what was in scope is what was not in scope. It was agreed very early on that the worst thing that we could do would be to get a group together and invent a bunch of new microservices and then say, hey, these are the greatest things since sliced bread. Go ahead and implement these. That's probably not going to happen. That might have happened several years ago when nobody had actually started building deployments based on microservice-based architectures, but that ship has sailed. So we need to work around solutions that people already have in place, approaches they already have in place, that sort of thing. Also, I think standardizing. A lot of people, when they hear the acronym SMPTE, they think, oh, standardization. They're going to think that the solution to everything is standardization. It's not necessarily, and I think in this case, standards might play a bit of a role, but I think there are a lot of other approaches that can be used. Going down rabbit holes based on specific use cases or edge cases can be a difficult thing to do, so that was clearly not in scope. And items that just don't have the broad application across the business were not things that we were going to look at. So what we did at the end of last year, kind of paused the group for a little bit, brought in who we thought were the appropriate companies and people to try to answer these questions and try to dedicate some work on it. We got a bunch of companies together for a pair of summit meetings in May, so just a couple months ago, one in the LA area and one in New York, trying to get the East Coast and West Coast perspectives on this, which was good. It was valuable because we actually had a diversity of opinions amongst the Hollywood crowd versus the New York crowd. So coming out of that, the message we got loud and clear from the vendors and the media companies who attended was that a common taxonomy was absolutely critical for this. If you're going to have interoperability across all these various little services, they need to be referring to the same things by the same names. Terms and definitions kind of fits into that as well. Resource management, important topic to deal with. Decomposition of services, how are we going to decompose all these down to a kind of common level of granularity? And then how are we going to kind of orchestrate that from an overall perspective? There are a lot of vendors with orchestration solutions out there, but how are we going to make sure that we can work across these various solutions? So security also always comes up as an important thing. And then, surprise, surprise, discovery yet again of how can we have these services easily discoverable in a standardized way so that people can find these things and implement them. When we talk about interoperability, so those were kind of the things that came out of the summit, but when we talked about interoperability, it became clear that there are two different things, and people think different things when you say interoperability. And the two different things are interoperability between vendors, but then also across platforms. And so those were both kind of things that we said that we needed to kind of focus on here. The group also felt that in addition to these high-level architectural things that that we all kind of need to get on the same page with, it would be important to come up with kind of what we called some quick wins. And I was encouraged by some of the earlier speakers talking about areas that might be ripe for microservice-based and cloud-based deployments. Advertising-related services came out loud and clear from the New York group, as you might expect, that facilitating various actions when it comes to ad placement and just ad management overall seemed to be an area that was would have a big impact, and it was felt that that was fairly easily accomplishable. Don't want to say easy too much, but relative to other things. And then out of the LA group, the Interoperable Master Format, IMF, not the International Monetary Fund, that services related to that, that seems to be an area that's getting a lot of traction, that started in the Hollywood area, but has really branched out into all types of media. Anybody who needs to do versioning of media in an efficient way and is tired of storing dozens, hundreds, or thousands of versions of the same piece of content and wants to be able to do that in more of a virtual type of environment, seems to find IMF of great interest. And the thinking was if we could define some standardized services that would invoke the various capabilities of IMF, that would be pretty cool. And that could be something that could be used fairly quickly. And it's something that could benefit from everybody being on the same page rather than vendor A taking one approach to this and vendor B taking their own approach to it. So, so IMF seemed to be an area that that had quite a bit of support. So I think that might be one that we might focus on fairly early. So where do we go from here? The next steps are we're planning on relaunching this group rather soon. Get a kind of a kickoff meeting with some inputs from the participants. And then kind of just assign some responsibilities. This being a SMPTE effort would rely on volunteers, but I think we have enough interested organizations and individuals who are feeling points of pain here and can see that all of us getting together and addressing some of these problems as a group is the right way to go and is the most efficient way to address the issues that we've got in place. So that's kind of where we're looking is in terms of next steps. I'd mentioned that just because this is something that SMPTE's had a great deal of interest in doesn't necessarily mean that standards are the entire answer, and I think they really aren't in this case. Hopefully there's nobody from SMPTE who's going to throw something at me up here. I think standards can play a role, but I don't think they're the full answer in this area. The biggest reason for that is that the whole idea behind this is being agile and being able to react to the industry needs quickly. And as we all know, standards aren't necessarily quick. It can take sometimes years to develop standards. And if we were to undertake something, let's say we started something in a few months and took 3 years to do it, I think the industry would have moved on, and what we did would have ended up being irrelevant. So I think the way to approach this is to, again, be a little more agile. SMPTE does have some new things that we can do called technical specifications, which are intended to be developed in a period of weeks, not months or years. And so that was music to my ears as I started looking at this and said, okay, well, that might be a little bit better suited to what we're trying to do here in the area of microservices in terms of getting things out there in the hands of implementers quickly. So that may be something that we do as a first step, these technical specifications, and then perhaps if they get traction and they ultimately belong to standards, we can move in that direction longer term. But I don't think there's any reason to undertake an effort that's going to take years here. I think it's the wrong approach. Industry education, also a critical part of this. If there's one thing we've learned by getting all the vendors together on this is that every one of them has a different perspective on what are microservices, what are the value of microservices, and how do we achieve true interoperability across the vendors and across the platforms using microservices. I think there's also under kind of the et cetera at the end of this slide, there's also I think a real opportunity to point at things that have already been done in other verticals in the area of microservices. There's no reason to invent something that's already been invented for some other purpose that we could just point to for our benefit. And I think some of that could be in the area of taxonomy and some other things that we've identified as priorities here. So again, I think if we can avoid inventing things that are not necessary to invent, we should do that. And again, that just allows us to do all this quicker, more efficiently, and get things out to the industry quicker. So that's kind of the overview and the pitch. If this is something that's interesting, if you are out there either from the media organization point of view or vendors serving the media industry and have found some challenges, should we say, in the area of interoperability with deploying microservice-based applications, and would like to bring some of that to us, I would love to hear from you personally. We've collected so far a group of 50 or 60 companies who think that there is an opportunity here to do something good, to make things easier for all of us. And so if you fall in that category, there's my contact information. I'd love to hear from you. We're very much in the recruiting phase right now, and this would be the time to get involved. We're going to, like I said, launch this rather soon, and we'd love to have you on board and have your input. So with that, I think I finished a few minutes early. We might have time for a few questions, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and we have a few minutes for questions.
I'm asking too many questions, so this would be a comment. MPAC has a project called Network-Based Media Processing. It basically tries to deploy media building workflows for the media processing using multiple nodes, and each node you can consider as a microservices. So I encourage you look at that project. Right now it's just at the last meeting went to draft international standards. It seems that there is a lot of synergy between that work and what you started at SIMTI. So I encourage you to look at it and see what MPAC and SIMTI can
That would be
do
wonderful.
together.
And yeah, we've unearthed a few things like that where we've said that there are other groups who have already done things that we think are very complementary, and that if stuff's already done, it's fantastic. It makes it easier for us. So, but that's one I wasn't familiar with. So I will take a look at that. Thank you.
Okay.
All right,
I
well,
think there-
join now.